This time my brother Johnny brought me 700 sewing needles and challenged me. Could I turn them into something that would completely shock him? Of course, I accepted the challenge. First, I prepared a steel container and packed all 700 sewing needles inside. Then I added steel powder to fill all the empty spaces between the needles. I made sure the container was packed tightly, then sealed it shut. Next, I fired up my charcoal forge and placed the container deep inside. I let it heat for a while, and once it was extremely hot, I started hammering it lightly from every side. I kept reheating the container and striking each side evenly, slowly compressing everything inside. Eventually, I could feel a difference through the hammer. The material inside had fused together into one solid mass. At that point, I shut down the forge and allowed the container to cool. Using an angle grinder, I cut off both ends and sliced along one side of the container. Then I peeled away the outer shell and removed the solid steel billet made from the needles. I welded a small handle onto the billet, fired up the forge again, and continued forging. This time, I could hit the steel much harder. The process took almost the entire day because I forge everything by hand with a hammer. No hydraulic press. First, I stretched the billet lengthwise. Then I flattened it into a plate approximately 3 to 4 millimeters thick and started forging the actual blade shape. I formed the tip and also shaped the handle area with my hammer. By the end of the day, I finally had the rough shape of a knife, and honestly, I was exhausted. The next morning, it was time to move to the belt grinder. Because of all the hammering, both sides were still uneven, so I started with a 36 grit belt and flattened the surfaces. Then I moved on to refining the contours until I had the final knife profile I wanted. I carefully corrected every detail of the shape. Next, I drilled the holes for the handle pins and also drilled the mounting point for the bolster. At this stage, the blade was finally starting to look like a real knife. Now came the part that requires the most precision for me: grinding the bevels. The bevels need to be straight, even, and symmetrical if I want the finished blade to look right. After several hours of careful grinding, the bevels were finally complete. Then I sanded the entire blade to 150 grit. After that, I fired up my charcoal forge once again. I heated the blade to approximately 850 degrees Celsius and quickly quenched it in the oil I had prepared beforehand. Now the steel was hardened and much stronger. I returned to sanding exactly where I had stopped. Starting at 150 grit, I gradually worked my way all the way up to 2000 grit. Then I thoroughly washed the blade with soap to remove any oil or grease from the surface. I placed it into ferric chloride for several minutes, removed it, rinsed it, and then placed it back into the solution again. And this was the result. Just look at that texture. The pattern was exactly what I had hoped to achieve. Now it was time for the handle. I made a simple but beautiful bolster from brass. I secured it using a single pin, carefully peening it from both sides with a hammer until the bolster was locked firmly in place. Next, I selected a solid piece of walnut and cut 2 wooden scales. I shaped both pieces on the belt grinder until I had the handle profile I wanted. Then I assembled everything using epoxy and brass pins. I left it to cure overnight. The next day, once the epoxy had fully hardened, I returned to the belt grinder and removed the excess wood. For the final finishing, I switched to 220 grit sandpaper and worked the handle by hand until all the scratches were gone and the surface was smooth. Then I applied a special protective wax. It brings out the beautiful grain of the walnut while also protecting the wood from moisture. Finally, I sharpened the blade all the way to 4000 grit. Now it's extremely sharp and cuts like a razor. And this is the finished result: a handmade knife forged from 700 sewing needles. If you think I won this challenge again, make sure to subscribe to my channel.